Hello, everyone. I am here with Charlotte Diamant, who is a sophomore at Wellesley College. She's been doing a project on studying the history of the South Natick Dam this semester as part of her environmental studies independent project. So she's going to share with us some of what she's learned and where she is on her project. So go ahead, Charlotte.
Awesome. Thanks, Becca. Yeah, so as a lot of you may know, the current dam in South Natick, it's just above the Pleasant Street Bridge. That dam was built in 1935, kind of at the tail end of the Depression. But before that dam, there have been a ton of different iterations of the dam, a ton of different property owners, and the river also used to look, and the dam used to look really different than it does right now. So this past semester, I've been looking into that and researching the history of the dam, and wanted to go a bit farther back than 1935 to the first iteration of the dam, which supposedly was all the way back in the 1700s. So, as some of you may know, one of the first white settlers in Natick was a man named Thomas Sawin in the late 1600s. And it's held that either his son or his grandson was the first to build a dam on the Charles River in Natick. And his property was a bit farther upstream, you can see right here, than the current dam, which is this red line kind of on the top of the screen. So it's a bit far from the current dam site, but supposedly that was the first dam built on the Charles in Natick in kind of the 1720s. And about a decade after that dam was built, a man named Hezekiah Broad inherited some of the property that the Sawins had that was a bit farther downstream over here, near this man named between Peabody and Carver. And he also had a dam on the Charles River, but also that dam got relocated up to a nearby brook that's circled right here on bordering his land with Peabody due to complaints from farmers that were farther upstream in what was called the Medfield Meadows. So even though Medfield and Medway seem really far away from Natick, supposedly farmers in this area complained that their properties had been inundated by Sawin's Dam and by Broad's Dam, and that led to a ton of legal disputes. Whether or not those dams actually caused the flooding seems a little unlikely, but complaints were filed, there was a years-long legal dispute, and so the dams ultimately got moved up some nearby tributaries to the Charles and off of the river itself. And then in 1742, another dam was built on the actual river in Natick by a man named Hastings, who relocated his dam to Sawin's property. He had built a sawmill and a grist mill and a paper mill. But the first dam that was actually on the site where the current one is in South Natick wasn't until 1778 with Deacon William Bigelow, who was the founder of the Bigelow Mills, which, as some of you may know, was a really huge business in Natick. This map is from the Natick Historical Society, and it shows a plan of the Bigelow Mills in about 1830. And you can see that for a while, the Bigelow family occupied property on the south side of the river, up on the north side of the river over here, kind of near where the Bacon Free Library is. And there's also the beginnings of the canal that still exists to this day. You can see kind of over here near the bottom of the screen. And the Bigelow family ultimately operated a sawmill, they had a paper mill and a grist mill, and all of this was at least partially powered by the mill dam that you can see right here. That was near where the current dam site is, above the Pleasant Street Bridge, but it's also stretching across the island that currently is below where the spillway is. So in that time, the dam actually existed in two parts. There was one stretching from the library side of the river to the island in the middle, and then another part stretching from the island to the south side of the dam, which I think is really interesting. So the dam and all the mill sites adjacent to it kind of existed in that same state for the next 50 years. Ultimately, Bigelow died and his sons inherited the property, but they kept operating it until about 1830 when it was sold at auction. And for the next 80-ish years, all these mill properties and the dam changed hands really frequently, about every decade or so. At one point, they belonged to a manufacturing company. At another point, they were used to make paper products, bedding products. So they were a huge site of industry and productivity over the years. In about 1838, this is a fun map that I really like because of all the color coding of Middlesex County. And you can see that the properties that Bigelow owned were transferred to a man named Curtis, who started operating another milling industry that primarily revolved around paper products. So you can see he also has mill sites on the north and south side of the river, and also on this mill canal or raceway that still exists. In this map, though, you can see that it connects kind of downstream to this other portion of the river, and water was diverted through it and used to cool things, used to power manufacturing, and throughout the ensuing decades, there's a lot, you can see on a lot of maps, this property on the raceway is a huge center for manufacturing and industry and is really important for whatever companies or corporations own those adjacent mills. So after Curtis, there's the flax leather manufacturing company that comes in and occupies all those properties. And you can see the dam still exists in two parts. It's still stretching over that center island. And there's also a little engineering house that gets built to monitor the dam and monitor the flow of water through the river, how it's being diverted. And that also becomes really important later when we start to be managing flooding and trying to protect downstream residences, which I'll circle back to a bit later. But after the flax leather manufacturing company, there's a very brief period of time where the dam is used for hydroelectric power. So in 1890, the Elliott Falls Electric Company moves in after the leather manufacturing company, and for about 4 years, they power almost 200 homes in Natick and Wellesley with power from this tiny dam, which is actually quite impressive considering how small it is. But after about 4 years, they realized the dam is just too small. It doesn't have enough power to make it really a successful enterprise. And they take their operation elsewhere, they relocate, and hydroelectric power is never really proposed on the dam site ever again until the 1980s. But it's still unsuccessful then. It's just not economically viable because it's so small. But it's kind of an interesting blip in the dam's history. So after that, these sites get converted to different forms of manufacturing. Rubber and cement get made in these sites for a while. The Boston Bedding Company moves in 1904 to this property on the mill race. And this map kind of shows how this part of South Natick stayed pretty much through the Great Depression. So the mill race exists here, connecting the upstream and downstream portions of the Charles. The dam still exists as a two-part dam over the island. Old Town Park gets acquired from the Honeywell and Shaw families next to the Free Library, and the Honeywell family also grants this portion of riverfront property to the town in the early 1900s. And there is still some form of manufacturing and industry existing on the mill race, but the mill properties on the north side and the south side of the dam are being put to less industrial use, kind of starting to become residencies and town parkland, and industries getting smaller and smaller. So the last company to kind of occupy this site as a form of industry is the Stewart Manufacturing Company, and they operate from about 1919 to 1929. And after that, of course, comes the Great Depression. And then that's kind of the end of the manufacturing era in South Natick related to the dam. But I want to backtrack a bit because during this entire period of time, there's also a really long history of flooding on the river. So pretty much as far back as the early 1800s, when you can find reliable newspaper documentation, there has been documentation of flooding on the river. And what I think is really interesting and important to note is that regardless of whether or not there's been a dam on the site, whether or not the dam has been intact or whether the dam has broken, whether or not it was due, like what time of year it was, there has always been flooding in the area. And you can go back all the way to, the early 1800s and see Boston Globe reports of flooding on water in Lincoln streets and, worries over the dam. And so these two articles I pulled up are both from the Boston Globe. They're both from relatively similar time periods, 1920s. They're both regarding late spring flooding in March or April. But one of them, the one on the left, is an article about flooding in South Natick on water in Lincoln streets, the area below the dam, when the dam stayed intact. And the town was really worried that the dam would fail, that it would cause really serious flooding. But flooding was happening even when the dam was staying intact. But in the article on the right, which is from, again, a really similar time period, the dam fails and there's a couple breakages in the dam. People are sent with sandbags to go try to shore it up. But again, there's still flooding. Those properties still flood regardless of whether or not the dam holds. So the dam has never really been important in flood control. It's been a concern, and people have always been, or at least up and through the 1920s, people were very concerned about the safety effects of the dam and how it would affect residential life and flooding, but that wasn't its primary purpose, and it's not really what it was built for. So in 1932, toward the tail end of the Depression, there was another big flood, and the dam breaks. But it's kind of left in that state for a while. It's not being used for any manufacturing or industrial needs. The Board of Health comes through and announces that even though it's broken and it doesn't look very nice, it's not a health hazard, it doesn't pose any additional flood risk, and so it's kind of fine to leave it as it is. And the town doesn't have a lot of money at that point because, you know, it's the early 30s, no one has a lot of money at that point, and so they just kind of leave it. But in the following spring, so March-ish of 1933, the residents of South Natick start agitating for repairs on the dam for 3 reasons. Even though the town finance board says it's not really economically feasible and they don't have to fix it according to the Board of Health or any supervisors, there's 3 main reasons that the town decides to fix the dam anyway. The first is aesthetic. So a lot of residents of South Natick, especially those people with property adjacent to the river, really wanted to fix the dam at or near the past site to beautify the property, to make it kind of an aesthetic center place of South Natick next to the bridge and the library. And that would especially, they thought, help raise the property values of the houses that were near that area. The second reason was for recreation. So there was an idea that if they were to rebuild the dam, they might be able to create a new swimming hole above the dam. And as industry had kind of started leaving the area, canoeing and rowing and swimming had all become a really big deal in the area. So starting in kind of the early 1900s, there was a boat launch farther upstream, there was a bathing beach, there was a swimming hole below the dam. And so they hoped that by rebuilding the dam, they could make a nicer, newer swimming hole above the dam that would be a little more aesthetic than the older one. And then lastly, it was the end of the Depression. So people hoped that by reconstructing the dam, they could provide labor opportunities for the town. And if you look at old newspaper articles, there are really a lot of sections talking about the economic benefits to the town and how many people are on the payroll and what the weekly payroll is in these different months. And there are also a lot of town meetings where the committee that's charged with overseeing the dam, reaffirms everyone that they are going to try to source all of their labor from Natick, both skilled and unskilled labor, and their final report does say that they were able to source almost all workmen from Natick, and the ones that weren't from Natick were either from Framingham or Needham or Wellesley, and that they got all of their materials from Boston or elsewhere in the local area. So they really did come through that, and it was really economic boom to the town. So finally, in 1935, the dam is finally finished. And there's this huge dedication ceremony. There's a couple articles you can see here about the dedication ceremony. And it is a very, very big deal in Natick. It's $15,000 over budget, but nobody really cares. So there's like state leaders that show up, local leaders. There's even a couple like federal lawmakers that come. Senator Walsh is there, and he calls it a national shrine and a testament to the federal aid program. There's 3,000 people. It's 2 hours long. There's an airplane, there's canoes, there's a historical parade. People come visit from out of town, and the Historical Society, provides them dinners and lectures, and a plaque is presented. It's a really, really big deal. And since that dam was finished in 1935, the site has remained pretty much the same. So if you compare this kind of old grainy picture of the dam, you can see it on the right, from 1935, with the one on the left, which is one from this winter of the spillway. You can see it's pretty much the same, even though the picture quality is a little better. The dam has really existed in that same state for the past couple decades. And now there is, a park on the south side of the dam across from Old Town Park that has kind of grown over the years and become more popular. But other than that, the property looks pretty much the same and is being used almost in exactly the way that the town envisioned it would be in 1935. We don't necessarily have a designated as popular a swimming hole maybe as the town envisioned in 1935. I think they had much grander plans for how that would turn out, but it is a really popular recreation area. It is much prettier than the broken old dam was, and it did provide labor opportunities. So that's kind of the cursory overview of the dam's history. And Becca, if you have any questions, I'm all ears.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've noticed as I pass through Natick all the time and going through South Natick is being able to check in on the dam and what's the water level look like now, and going through the droughts that we had a few years ago and how you would see ducks sitting basically on the dam because the water was just not really there to, the past few months with the water just filling the area. I think it is very interesting to see that there was flooding before, and that didn't really change whether or not the dam was there or not. I guess the berm, has the berm been there the whole time? I mean, it looks like.
Yeah, so the berm was, when the town built the dam, they collaborated with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, and even though the town was in charge of the major construction of the dam, there were little kind of pockets of activity that FERA helped with, and there's a final report that the town submitted of what the town did and what FERA did, and one of the things that they're listed as doing is helping with the construction of the earthen embankment. So from that, like reading that document, it seems to me like the earthen embankment was not always there, or if it was there, it was in a much more reduced capacity, and the town worked with FERA to create that berm to shore up the dam, both to make the little parkway and like make the spillway. But there's also a line about how they hoped creating the berm would help protect the island that's below the dam, and they had also visions of planting a bunch of trees on the island and making it kind of another beauty spot near the dam. So I think it was supposed to be kind of a dual purpose, both for the dam and protecting the island.
Yeah. Has your research involved any look at sort of the environmental implications from a animal life or habitat?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of know for sure how the area looked and was before then, like, there has kind of been dams and mill activity and just human presence there for so long. But what I have found out is before the dams were built, the river did flow in a different way, which I think is really cool. So it used to be that the dam was extended just from the center island to the north shore of the river, and the kind of south portion from the island to that like current picnic area where all the pine trees are wasn't really the natural, like the river didn't really flow there, it was too shallow. And then one year there was this huge like spring flood, and the water was so powerful that it like found a course around the island and excavated this deep hole there. And so after that flood, I think it was in like the early 1800s, the river flowed around the other side of the island as well and kind of made it a true island. And then a second dam had to be built there to hold the water back. And aside from that, there are a couple references of years of severe drought when the water level fell a lot, and you could see like the Indian stepping stones that were farther upstream that used to be the old river crossing, which, is not necessarily related to like wildlife or the natural habitat, but is kind of interesting to see how people used to cross the river, interact with the river before colonists came and before the dam was built and the Pleasant Street Bridge was built.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting. I think that, the South Natick Dam is definitely a place that all Natick residents, like we know, we see it. There's likely interactions we've had with it. I think one thing that's funny that's happening right now is I saw in the photo that you posted from this winter, there's the log that's like right on the precipice. And for months, every time I drive by, I say, oh, log's still there, and just found out there is actually a hashtag called Log Watch And
Oh
a lot
my
of people are watching, waiting to see when that log is going to tip over, and
gosh.
wondered if the winds this past week were going to do it, and they didn't. The log is still there. So,
Well,
so it's a nice way for all of us to be connected to the nature that is around us.
yeah.
So how do you plan to share your research findings?
Yeah, so because I'm doing all of this in part for course credit with Wellesley, I am going to be submitting a final story map for my class, which is a really, really cool format. Um, it's basically like if an essay and a PowerPoint merged together. So it lets you incorporate maps and photos and even video content and some like GIS features into your presentation, and you can include blocks of text next to them. So I'm hoping to submit that format for my class, and I'm also working with some folks in the Natick Department of Water and Power to kind of make that available to anybody in the town if anyone's interested. And I'm also trying to put together the resources that I found in some kind of shareable format. So, you know, those can likewise get sent to people in town if they're interested. I know the Natick Historical Society does have a great file on the history of the dam. If anyone's interested, I've been there. It's awesome. But I also, you know, in the past semester went to the Harvard Map Collection and the Boston Public Library, and found a bunch of old newspaper articles and photos and maps and stuff that I'm hoping I can share with the town as well.
Great.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Is there
Yeah.
anything else that you can think that you'd like anyone to know about the dam? Any little tidbit that you were like, wow, that's cool,
Ooh,
that you haven't shared yet?
yeah. Oh no, that's a good question. There have been so many random tidbits. One of my favorites was when the town was agitating to build the new dam in 1933. They had this whole town meeting to kind of put together the findings of the finance board and the town residents. And they had a bunch of speakers. They were going to vote on the dam. And the finance board was really opposed to it because they didn't think they had the funds. And so all of the employees of the town of Natick got together and said that they would contribute like 7.5% of their annual salary to help build the dam.
Wow.
The townspeople voted to like support that and take their money and go build the dam. Which I was like very surprised by, but
yeah,
they're very determined.
yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you again. I appreciate that you've been working on this project, and I appreciate that you've taken the time to share it with us.
Yeah, thank you, Becca.